The building had always felt different at night. During the day, it was alive with the hum of conversations, the click of polished shoes against marble floors, the rustle of papers and the steady rhythm of keyboards in offices stacked one after another across 20 shining stories. But once the last of the employees filed out and the lights dimmed floor by floor, it transformed into something else entirely. To me, the night belonged. The echo of my mop across the tiled halls was a song I had grown used to, the whisper of the cleaning cart wheels following me like a loyal companion. For most, it was a place of business, of power, of ambition. For me, it was survival. I was the janitor, the man who erased the evidence of their long days so they could return to spotless desks and gleaming hallways. My work was invisible, my presence unnoticed, and I had accepted long ago that this was my role in life. That night began no differently than the countless others before it. I had my sleeves rolled up, my uniform damp from hours of scrubbing, and my hands carried the faint sting of disinfectant. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, as though reminding me that even machines grew weary after a long day. The hall was silent, save for the low creak of my cart and the steady rhythm of my breathing. I had grown comfortable in the solitude, almost grateful for it, because in those hours I could be myself without the weight of judgment or the pity I often imagined in people's eyes. But then, as I passed the executive floor, something unusual stirred in the silence. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. A sound softer than the hum of the air conditioning, a rhythm that didn't belong to the building's usual nighttime symphony. I paused, my mop resting against the wall, my ears straining. There it was, again muffled, almost hidden, like a wounded animal tucked away in the shadows. It was crying. Someone, somewhere, was crying. The sound sent a ripple of unease down my spine. This was the executive floor, the domain of men and women who carried themselves with power, who spoke in commands rather than requests, whose suits cost more than I made in a month. Crying didn't belong here, not in these halls of steel and glass. Yet the sound persisted, weaving itself through the silence until I couldn't deny it anymore. My heart began to pound. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the strange intimacy of hearing pain where only power was meant to exist. I moved cautiously, the wheels of my cart squeaking faintly against the polished floor as I followed the sound. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though I was crossing an invisible line I had no business approaching. The closer I got, the clearer it became low, choked sobs echoing from the far end of the corridor. My hand gripped the mop handle tighter, a poor weapon against a fear I couldn't even name. Who could it be? A late employee, exhausted from the weight of their life? A broken intern crushed under pressure? My mind searched for possibilities, but nothing prepared me for what I found. There, slumped in the corner of his office with the door left ajar, was a man I had only ever seen as a figure of legend in this building. His suit jacket was discarded across the leather chair, his tie loosened carelessly as though even the fabric had become unbearable. His face was buried in his hands, shoulders trembling with every uneven breath, and the sound of his sobs filled the room like cracks spreading across glass. It was him, the CEO. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat, my body frozen, as though I had stumbled into a place I was never meant to enter. The CEO was not supposed to be human, at least not in the way the rest of us were. He was power in its purest form, a man whose presence alone commanded silence in boardrooms and fear in employees. People spoke of him in hushed tones, either with admiration for his brilliance or fear of his ruthless decisions. I had watched him walk through these halls with the certainty of a man who had never once bent under the weight of doubt, whose life was carved out of victories stacked higher than the building itself. Yet here he was, broken in the shadows, the sound of his pain undeniable. I should have looked away. Every instinct in me screamed to back out quietly, to disappear into the safety of invisibility that had been my armor for years. Men like him weren't meant to be seen like this, not by people like me. His pain was not mine to witness, his weakness not mine to know. If he noticed me standing there, would it cost me my job? Would he see my presence as intrusion, as betrayal? My palms grew slick with sweat, my heart drumming so loudly I feared he might hear it even through his sobs. And yet, I couldn't move. Something rooted me to the spot. Something deeper than fear and stronger than duty. It was disbelief, yes, but also something else, curiosity, maybe even recognition, because in those muffled cries, in the trembling of his shoulders, I heard something I knew too well. Loneliness, desperation, the weight of burdens too heavy to carry alone. It was the sound of a man unraveling, and though his suit was finer, his office larger, his world infinitely grander, the pain was the same as mine. I thought of all the nights I had spent crying quietly in my own silence, careful not to wake my children with the sound of my despair. I thought of the nights when bills piled higher than hope, when my reflection in the mirror seemed more like a ghost than a man. I had known the taste of hopelessness, the ache of being invisible, and in that moment, I saw it reflected in the most powerful man in the building. My throat tightened, my chest heavy with the weight of understanding I didn't want but couldn't escape. I wanted to turn away, to grant him the privacy his position deserved, to erase the image from my mind before it could become something dangerous. But I also knew what it felt like to cry alone in the dark, to believe no one in the world could or would ever care enough to notice. And I wondered, just for a moment, if he needed someone to notice now. My mind waged war against itself. "Walk away," it hissed, "before he sees you, before you ruin everything." But another voice, softer yet stronger, whispered back, "Maybe he doesn't need a CEO tonight. Maybe he just needs someone to be human with him." The seconds stretched endlessly, my hand still clutching the mop as though it tethered me to a world I understood. My eyes lingered on the sight before me, the image of power reduced to fragility, of authority undone by grief, and I realized that this was no ordinary night. This was a moment I was never meant to witness, yet one I could not unsee. I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening as though the very air was urging me toward a decision. My feet felt heavy, my heart conflicted, but deep inside, I knew the truth. I knew I had a choice. Walk away, or step closer. To see the strongest man alive cry is to question everything you believed about him. I had spent years watching him from a distance, though to say watching hardly felt accurate. No one really looked at him the way they looked at other men. He wasn't the kind of person you could observe without feeling the burn of his presence in return, because he carried himself like a storm, wrapped in a suit, commanding, untouchable, the kind of man whose footsteps alone could still an entire hallway. The CEO of this towering empire wasn't just a man, he was a force. His name was spoken in whispers, not because it was forbidden, but because it carried weight. When people said his name, they said it the way you might speak of a god or a curse, something powerful enough to make or break lives. To me, he had always been nothing more than the silhouette at the end of a hall, the flash of a tailored suit vanishing behind the glass doors of the top floor, the low timbre of a voice that could silence a boardroom even when spoken softly. I had seen the way other employees straightened when he passed, how even department heads lowered their voices in his presence. Fear and respect were the air that followed him, and for men like me, men with mops in their hands and cleaning solution in their carts, that air felt suffocating. I never imagined I would stand this close to him, much less in a moment when all of that myth had collapsed. Because the man I saw slumped in that leather chair, his shoulders hunched and shaking, was not the CEO who had built an empire out of steel and numbers and ambition. He was not the untouchable figure whose sharp eyes had been rumored to reduce executives to stammers. He was simply a man with his face buried in his hands, his breath ragged with the force of his grief, his tears leaving stains on skin I had thought was too hardened to ever break. The contrast was staggering, and it left me rooted to the spot as though my mind could not reconcile what my eyes were showing me. How could this be the same man who owned these glass walls, who looked down on the city from the top floor as if the streets below belonged to him? How could someone who carried power like a second skin now sit here unraveling, his sobs echoing in the silence like a wound made audible? It was like watching a monument crumble, the strongest pillar in the building collapsing in on itself, and I felt my own chest tighten with a strange, unexplainable ache. I hesitated at the door, my fingers tightening around the edge as though bracing myself. Every instinct warned me to back away, to close the door gently and pretend I had seen nothing. He had built his entire existence on being untouchable, and to intrude on this moment of vulnerability felt like trespassing on sacred ground. Yet the longer I stood there, the harder it became to retreat, because the sound of his sobs was not the sound of a man who needed space. It was the sound of someone who had been left alone for too long. I took a tentative step inside, the polished floor gleaming beneath the dim light that spilled from the desk lamp. My cleaning cart squeaked faintly behind me, and the sound made me flinch, as though the walls themselves would betray me for being there. I paused, unsure of what I could possibly offer. What comfort could a janitor give to a man who owned skyscrapers and silenced boardrooms with a glance? And yet, when I looked at him, I didn't see a CEO anymore. I saw a man breaking. There was a half-empty glass of water sitting on the corner of his desk, untouched, forgotten. My hands moved before my mind could argue, reaching for the pitcher that sat beside it, filling the glass with trembling care, as if the simple act of pouring water was a gesture large enough to bridge the gap between us. I carried it toward him slowly, my steps hesitant, the glass cool against my skin, the liquid trembling inside it just as much as my own heart trembled in my chest. I set it on the table beside him, close enough that he would notice it, far enough that he could pretend he hadn't. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge me, but I didn't expect him to. I wasn't there for thanks. I wasn't even sure why I was there at all. Perhaps it was because I knew what it meant to need something, anything, that reminded you the world still saw you. Perhaps it was because in that moment, I wasn't a janitor and he wasn't a CEO. We were simply two men who carried more than our shoulders were built to bear. I thought about speaking. 1,000 words pushed against the walls of my throat, questions and apologies and reassurances, but every one of them felt like it would shatter the fragile silence between us. So, instead, I pulled a chair across from him, the sound of its legs against the floor louder than I had intended, and I sat down quietly. No words, no explanations, just presence. The silence, stretched on, thick with the weight of what remained unspoken. He kept his face buried in his hands, his breath coming in uneven gasps, and I simply sat there, unsure if I was a comfort or a curse. My eyes wandered the office, the shelves lined with books and awards, the paintings that must have cost more than my yearly salary, the view of the city outside where the lights glimmered like stars scattered on the ground. All of it spoke of a life so far beyond mine that we might as well have lived on different planets. And yet here we were, trapped in the same room, bound together not by wealth or status but by the fragility of human pain. I remembered something my father once told me before life swallowed him whole with debts and exhaustion. He said that sometimes the greatest kindness you can give another person is silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of presence, the kind that says, I am here, even if I cannot fix you. I thought of that as I sat there, as the seconds became minutes and the minutes stretched into something timeless. And for the first time in years, I understood what he had meant. Because in that moment, it didn't matter that my uniform was stained and his shirt was silk, or that my life had been built on sweeping floors while his had been built on conquering boardrooms. What mattered was that he was not alone in his crying. I watched his hands tremble where they pressed against his face, the faint sheen of tears slipping between his fingers. I felt a pang of something I hadn't expected, empathy, maybe even sorrow for a man I had once believed incapable of either. I had hated him from afar for his coldness, for the way his decisions trickled down to men like me who had no choice but to endure the consequences. Yet here he was, stripped of every layer that made him untouchable, and I realized that even the strongest man alive was still just a man. The weight of that realization was almost unbearable, because if someone like him could fall apart, what did that mean for the rest of us who were already broken? I leaned back in the chair, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. My throat ached with unspoken words, but I swallowed them down because this moment wasn't about me, it was about him, about the fracture I was witnessing in the armor of a man the world believed was made of steel. And though I knew I had no right to be here, no place in this story, I stayed. Because maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, filling the silence with its rhythm. His breathing slowed, though the tremors in his shoulders remained. He shifted slightly, his posture stiffening, as though he had become aware of another presence. My pulse quickened, fear knotting in my stomach. If he lifted his head, if he saw me, what would happen? Would I be dismissed instantly, punished for daring to exist in his most fragile moment? Or would something else happen? Something neither of us could yet name. I braced myself, my palms damp with sweat, my heart pounding with anticipation I could not control. And then, he lifted his head and looked straight at me. Sometimes one question can break the last wall someone has. His head lifted slowly, as if it weighed more than he could carry, and for the first time I saw his face without the mask he wore for the world. His eyes were red-rimmed, wet with tears that caught the lamplight, his expression raw in a way that made my stomach twist. For years, I had seen him only at a distance, his face carved from stone, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the air, but now his features seemed softer, undone, like a statue that had begun to crumble. His eyes landed on me, confusion first, then shock, and for a fleeting second I saw something else, anger. It was gone almost as quickly as it had come, but that flash was enough to make my pulse race. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a hard line, and the weight of his stare pinned me to my seat. I felt like a trespasser, like a thief caught in the act, and part of me wanted to rise, to stammer an apology, and retreat back into the shadows where I belonged. Yet, even as fear clawed at me, I couldn't move. I had seen too much already, and something inside me whispered that walking away now would be a cruelty far greater than staying. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, but the words came before I could stop them. They slipped out like a breath I had been holding too long, simple yet dangerous, a question that carried the weight of breaking through a fortress no one had ever dared to approach. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice low, fragile, almost apologetic. For a moment, the silence that followed was worse than his tears. His eyes narrowed slightly, his body stiffening as though my words had struck him in a place no one had ever touched. The flicker of anger returned, sharper this time, his stare cutting into me like a blade. My heart thundered in my chest, and I regretted the question instantly. Who was I to ask him that? Who was I, a janitor with worn shoes and calloused hands, to intrude on the pain of a man who owned everything in sight? I braced myself for the dismissal, the harsh words I was certain would follow, the reminder of my place in this world. But instead of lashing out, instead of silencing me with his authority, he did something I didn't expect. His gaze faltered, his shoulders slumped further, and in that shift, the anger drained into something else entirely. Despair. It washed over his face like a tide he could no longer hold back, leaving him looking smaller, more fragile, more human than I had ever imagined. My chest ached at the sight, a strange mixture of fear and empathy tangling inside me, and I knew I had stepped into territory I couldn't retreat from. Still, doubt gnawed at me. I wondered if I had made the greatest mistake of my life. I wasn't supposed to speak to him, unless spoken to. I wasn't supposed to exist in his world beyond the tasks that made me invisible. The weight of hierarchy pressed down on me, reminding me that I had crossed a line, that I had breached the walls of a fortress where I did not belong. I imagined the consequences: losing this job, losing the fragile lifeline it provided for my family, and panic clawed at my chest. Yet beneath the fear, another truth whispered. If I hadn't asked, if I had stayed silent, would I have been able to live with myself after watching him fall apart in the dark? He shifted, leaning back in his chair, his hands dragging across his face as though he could wipe away the evidence of his breakdown. His breathing was uneven, shaky, the kind of breath you take when your body refuses to let you hide your pain any longer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, so quiet I almost missed it. "You wouldn't understand." The words cut through the room like a blade, sharper than any reprimand, heavier than any dismissal. My chest tightened, my heart sinking with the weight of them. He wasn't wrong. I wasn't part of his world. I hadn't built empires or commanded boardrooms. I hadn't worn suits that cost more than my rent. What could a man like me possibly understand about the burdens carried by a man like him? And yet, the certainty with which he said it sparked something inside me. Because while I couldn't understand his wealth, his power, or his influence, I understood the sound of loneliness in his voice. I understood the look in his eyes when despair stripped him bare. For a few long moments, I sat there frozen, torn between retreat and defiance. My instincts screamed at me to lower my gaze, to bow my head and slip back into invisibility, but something deeper, something older, rose in me instead. I had seen too much pain in my own life, too much grief, too much of the silent suffering no one else wanted to witness, and I recognized it now in him. Perhaps he was right. I couldn't understand the life he lived, but I could understand the breaking. I shifted in my chair, my hands twisting together nervously in my lap. My voice trembled when I spoke again, but it carried a strength I didn't know I had. Maybe not, I admitted softly, but that doesn't mean no one should ask. His eyes flickered toward me, surprise breaking through the despair for just an instant. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough to tell me that my words had struck something inside him. He didn't respond, didn't challenge me, but his silence was no longer the silence of dismissal. It was something else, hesitation, maybe even consideration. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on my chest. My palms were damp, my breath shallow, my body caught between the urge to flee and the need to stay. I didn't know what had compelled me to push further, to speak again when every rule of this world told me I should remain quiet. But something in his eyes, something in the way his voice had broken, told me that if I didn't, the moment would be lost forever. I sat there, my heart hammering, my thoughts screaming at me to stop, to preserve what little safety I had left. But against every instinct of survival, against every rule I had ever lived by, I felt the words rise again, unstoppable, uncontainable. Because sometimes silence is not mercy, it is abandonment. And I could not abandon him, not when he had already been left alone with his pain for too long. But I couldn't stop myself. I asked, anyway. Even kings bleed when they are finally seen. For a long moment after my question, the silence hung between us like a curtain neither of us knew how to pull aside. He stared past me, his eyes fixed on something distant that only he could see, his jaw tight as though he were holding words behind his teeth with sheer force of will. I could feel the weight of his hesitation pressing into the air, thick and suffocating, a silent battle, playing out in the lines of his face. Men like him weren't supposed to speak of weakness, weren't supposed to let anyone see the cracks. He had spent years, maybe decades, building a fortress of control around himself, and I had just asked him to open the gates. I almost apologized, the word sorry burning the back of my throat. But before I could speak, he exhaled a sharp, uneven breath. His hands fell away from his face, leaving behind skin flushed from tears and eyes heavy with exhaustion. He leaned back in the chair, shoulders sagging as if carrying a weight too great for even him to bear. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, hoarse, stripped of the authority that usually silenced rooms. "You asked if I'm okay," he said slowly, his words halting as though each one had to be dragged into the light. "The truth is, I don't know if I've been okay in a very long time." The admission startled me, not just because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no anger in his tone, no demand for me to leave, no mask of indifference, just honesty, raw, reluctant, but undeniable. For a man who had built an empire on certainty, on never letting doubt show, it was like hearing a crack spread through the strongest glass. He rubbed a hand across his face, his fingers trembling faintly, and let out a bitter laugh that carried no humor. People look at me and they see power. They see wealth. They see success. But none of that matters when you go home, and the silence is louder than any applause. His gaze dropped to the floor, his voice growing softer. Money can build you towers. It can buy you loyalty, but it can't stop betrayal. It can't cure loneliness, and it sure as hell can't fix a broken family. I felt my chest tighten, my heart pounding with each word he spoke. These were not the words of a CEO. They were the words of a man stripped bare, a man bleeding quietly behind walls too high for anyone to climb. "My family," he began, his voice breaking slightly before he steadied himself. "They've never forgiven me for what I became. They wanted a son, a brother, a husband. But I became a CEO instead. To them, every decision I made for the company was a decision against them. Every hour I spent building this empire was an hour stolen from them. And maybe they're right. Maybe I traded them for this life. But now, even with all of this," he gestured vaguely toward the gleaming office, the view of the glittering city beyond the windows. "Even with everything people think they want, I'm left with nothing that matters." His words struck me harder than I expected. I thought of the people in my own life who had slipped away, of the nights when work had swallowed my presence at home, of the silent sacrifices that had cost me relationships I couldn't repair. And in that moment, I realized that though the worlds we lived in were miles apart, the loneliness was the same. He leaned forward, his elbows resting heavily on his knees, his eyes staring at the floor, as if the polished wood held the answers to questions that haunted him. "And betrayal," he whispered, his voice almost breaking. "That's the wound that never closes. When you trust someone with your whole life, when you let them into the part of yourself no one else gets to see, and they use it against you." He shook his head, a tremor in his hands as though the memory itself was too heavy to hold. "It doesn't matter how many walls you build after that. The damage is already done." I swallowed hard, my throat tight, my own memories rising unbidden. I thought of times I had been betrayed, not by business partners or high-powered allies, but by friends I thought would stand beside me when life grew cruel. I thought of the pain of realizing someone you leaned on could just as easily let you fall. His betrayal might have been dressed in finer clothes, wrapped in contracts and corporate politics, but the wound was the same. I wanted to say something, anything, to ease the weight of his confession, but I stopped myself. He didn't need my judgment or my pity. He didn't even need my advice. What he needed was someone to listen, someone who wouldn't turn away, someone who would let him bleed without shame. So I sat still, my hands folded in my lap, my silence not empty but present. The kind of silence that said, "I hear you." His eyes lifted then, just briefly, and for the first time I saw something in them I had never expected. Gratitude. It was faint, almost hidden, but it was there, flickering like a candle in the dark. And then it was gone, replaced by something heavier, something that made his voice crack when he spoke again. "Do you know what the worst part is?" he asked, his words trembling as though he hated admitting them. "You can have everything. The cars, the houses, the power, the respect. You can own half the city, and still," he paused, his throat tightening, his eyes glossing over with tears that threatened to fall again, "and still feel like the loneliest man alive." The sentence hung in the air, raw and heavy, and I felt it echo inside me in ways I hadn't expected. Because I knew that loneliness, not the loneliness of wealth, but the loneliness of invisibility, the loneliness of being unseen, unheard, forgotten in the corners of a world that didn't care if you survived it. We were from different universes, but at that moment, our pain was the same language. I leaned forward slightly, my voice soft but steady. "Sometimes, the things that matter most can't be bought," I said quietly, almost to myself. "And the things that can be bought usually matter least." He didn't answer, but his gaze flickered toward me again, sharper this time, as if my words had touched a truth he didn't want to acknowledge. He let out another bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You sound like someone who's lost more than they've gained." I didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. But this wasn't about me, and I wouldn't let my own scars take away from his moment of truth. So I stayed silent again, offering him the one thing no one else seemed to have given him space to be human. For a while, he said nothing, his breaths slow and uneven, his eyes fixed on some invisible horizon far beyond the walls of this office. Then, finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter than before, so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "Do you know what it's like?" he whispered. "To walk into a room full of people who fear you, and still feel invisible?" The question sent a shiver down my spine, because I did know. Not in the way he meant it, not with rooms filled with powerful men and women, but in the way of cleaning rooms, where no one ever acknowledged me, of existing in places where my presence was only noticed when something was wrong. The irony of his words was staggering. He lived at the top of the world, I lived at the bottom, and yet we were both invisible in our own way. I watched him then, the man behind the power, the king who had bled in silence for so long, and I felt the enormity of what he had just given me. This was not a conversation he had ever intended to have. This was not a truth he had planned to share. But here he was, unraveling, piece by piece, in front of a janitor who had simply asked if he was okay. The clock ticked in the corner, the city lights glowed through the window, and for a moment the world outside seemed to hold its breath. I sat there, listening, carrying the weight of his confession not as a burden but as a gift, because I knew how much it cost to let someone else see the blood you'd hidden for so long. And just when I thought the moment had reached its heaviest point, when I thought he had said all there was to say, he drew in a shaky breath and looked me straight in the eye. His lips parted, his voice breaking with the effort, and he said, something that made the air in my lungs freeze. But then, he said something that made me freeze in disbelief. Sometimes the strongest men are destroyed by the softest betrayals. His eyes stayed locked on mine, and I felt a chill run down my spine, not because of fear, but because of the weight I could see pressing behind them. They were eyes that had stared down competitors, silenced boardrooms, and commanded entire industries. Yet now they trembled with something far greater than power grief. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way I had never heard from him before, the sound jagged, like glass breaking under pressure. "It wasn't the business that broke me," he said softly, his gaze dropping to his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. "It wasn't the money, or the endless hours, or the pressure everyone talks about. I could handle all of that. I always could. What broke me was the people I trusted most." He paused, and for a moment I thought he wouldn't continue, that he would retreat back into silence and let the moment pass. But then he exhaled, long and ragged, and the words poured out like water breaching a dam. "My brother," he whispered. "The one person I thought would stand beside me no matter what. We built everything together, every dream, every plan, every step of this empire. He was the only one who knew the cost of what we were building, the sleepless nights, the sacrifices. I trusted him with everything. And he sold me out." The confession hung in the air, sharp and heavy, and I felt the sting of it as though the betrayal were my own. His jaw tightened, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He sold company secrets to our competitors, secrets only I had shared with him. When I confronted him, he didn't even deny it. He said he was tired of being in my shadow, tired of the world calling me the genius and him the assistant. So he took the one thing he could, my trust, and turned it into a weapon. He dragged a hand across his face, his composure cracking further with each word. "Do you know what it feels like to sit across from your own blood, the person you would have given your life for, and realize they've been carving knives behind your back the entire time? I built walls around myself after that. Higher, stronger, until no one could get close enough to hurt me again. But it doesn't matter how many walls you build when the betrayal comes from family. The wound never heals. It festers. It eats at you until even success tastes like ash." I sat in silence, my heart twisting at his words. For the first time, I saw him not as a CEO, not as the untouchable figure everyone feared, but as a man bleeding from wounds that no empire could shield him from. His voice trembled, his shoulders slumped, and in that moment he looked smaller than I had ever imagined possible. But he wasn't finished. He drew in another uneven breath, his eyes clouded with something deeper, darker. And when he spoke again, the pain in his voice was almost unbearable. And then there was her. he said quietly, his throat tightening around the words. The woman I thought I would spend my life with. She was my anchor when the storms came, the one place I thought I could be myself without judgment. For years, I believed she loved me, not the wealth, not the reputation, but me. I believed she saw the man behind the power. But I was wrong. She saw opportunity, and when the chance came, she left with someone else. Someone I had called a friend. He laughed then, but it was hollow, bitter, the sound of a man mocking his own foolishness. Can you imagine that? All the power, all the money, all the influence in the world, and it still wasn't enough to make her stay. In the end, I wasn't the man she wanted. I was just the stepping stone to someone she thought could give her more. His voice broke then, a single tear slipping down his cheek before he wiped it away with the back of his hand, as though ashamed of the evidence. But the damage was already visible, written in the tremor of his hands, in the way his words carried more sorrow than any victory speech ever could. I swallowed hard, my own chest heavy with memories I hadn't wanted to revisit. His story wasn't mine, not exactly, but the echoes were undeniable. I thought of the times I had been betrayed by those I had called friends, the times I had given everything to someone only to be abandoned when I had nothing left to offer. I thought of the people who had walked out of my life when I needed them most, leaving me to pick up the pieces in silence. And in that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. No matter how different our worlds were, pain spoke the same language. His betrayal might have come dressed in wealth and boardrooms, mine in poverty and shadows, but the wound felt the same. For the first time since I had walked into that office, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel like a janitor intruding in a world that wasn't mine. I felt like a man sitting across from another man, both of us scarred by the same cruel hands of trust and love turned against us. He looked at me then, his eyes glassy with tears he could no longer hide. You asked if I was okay, he said, his voice hoarse. The truth is, I don't even know what that word means anymore. How can I be okay when the people I loved most are the ones who broke me? How can I believe in anything when the foundations of my life were built on lies? I wanted to answer him, to tell him that survival itself was proof of strength, that sometimes the fact you were still breathing was enough. But the words stuck in my throat, because I knew they would sound hollow. Instead, I let the silence stretch, not as abandonment, but as presence. Sometimes, silence was the only language grief could understand. The seconds passed like hours, the ticking of the clock filling the space between us. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes staring at the ceiling as if searching for answers that refused to come. His breathing was heavy, his hands trembling, and I realized he wasn't just confessing to me, he was confessing to himself, admitting aloud what he had buried so deeply he had almost convinced himself it didn't exist. And then, slowly, his hand moved to his chest pocket. His fingers trembled as they reached inside, fumbling slightly, as though the act itself carried a weight he wasn't sure he could lift. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him, unsure of what he was reaching for, unsure of what memory or truth he was about to summon into the room with us. When he pulled it free, the object was small, worn, its edges frayed from being handled too many times. A photograph. He held it loosely between his fingers, his eyes locked on it as though it carried the entirety of his past, his pain, his loss. And in that instant, I knew whatever was on that photograph would change everything I thought I understood about him. And then, he pulled out a photo from his pocket. One image can unravel an entire world. His hand trembled as he held the photo, the thin paper looking almost fragile in his grip, as though it might disintegrate under the weight of the memories it carried. The corners were worn, bent from years of being pulled out and put away, its surface creased like a map of grief traced over and over again. He didn't hand it to me at first. He simply stared at it, his eyes locked on the faded image with such intensity that I wondered if, in his mind, he wasn't just looking at the picture but reliving the life behind it. I sat still, hardly breathing, my gaze fixed on the photograph he held as if it contained the answer to every unspoken question in the room. His lips parted once, twice, as though he wanted to speak, but the words refused to come. Instead, his thumb brushed over the surface of the photo with a tenderness that was almost unbearable to watch, like a man afraid that even the act of remembering might destroy what little he had left. Finally, his voice broke the silence, low and raw. "This," he whispered, "is the reason I can't let go. No matter how much I try, no matter how many walls I build, it always comes back to this." He turned the photo slightly, just enough for me to glimpse the faded colors, the blurred outlines of figures frozen in time. My pulse quickened, my chest tightening with an anticipation I couldn't explain. It was just a photo, I told myself. A piece of paper with an image. But something about the way he looked at it, something about the way his voice trembled, told me it was more than that. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he held it out toward me. "Go on," he said softly, his eyes heavy with sorrow. "Look." I reached for it with hands that shook as much as his, my fingers brushing the edges of the worn paper as though it were something sacred. When I finally turned it fully toward me, my breath caught in my throat. The image was faded with time, but clear enough to strike me like lightning. It was a family photo. A younger version of him stood stiffly in the center, his arm around a woman whose smile was bright enough to outshine the fading edges of the picture. Beside her, 2 children stood close, their small faces lit with innocence, unaware of the weight the future would place upon them. At first, I thought it was the ordinary intimacy of the photo that unsettled me, the softness of his expression, so different from the man I had always known, the warmth in his posture that contradicted everything the world said about him. But then my eyes fell on one of the children, and that was when my heart stopped. I leaned closer, squinting, my pulse racing so fast it roared in my ears. The boy in the photo, the smaller of the 2 children, looked achingly familiar. His eyes, wide and bright, were ones I had seen before, not in this office, not in this building, but in the mirror of my own memories. The shape of his face, the curve of his smile, the faint scar just above his brow. It was like staring into a ghost of someone I knew, someone who had been part of my own life story. My chest tightened, my breathing uneven. "This can't be," I whispered under my breath, the words slipping out before I could stop them. I looked at the CEO, then back at the photograph, then back at him again, the image burning itself into my vision like a brand I couldn't erase. He noticed my reaction instantly. His brows furrowed, his gaze sharpening with curiosity, maybe even suspicion. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but lined with something darker, as though he feared my answer. I tried to speak, but my throat closed, my mind spinning with 1,000 possibilities. Why did this child feel so familiar? Why did I feel as though I had seen him not just once, but many times before? And why did my gut twist with the undeniable certainty that this photo didn't just belong to him, it belonged to me too? My hand trembled as I held the picture, my fingers brushing over the small boy's face. Memories surged, fragmented and confusing, like flashes of a dream I couldn't quite piece together. A face in a crowd, a name whispered years ago, a story my parents had told me about someone lost, someone who had vanished from our lives before I was old enough to remember clearly. And now, here it was, staring back at me from the palm of my hand. I forced myself to breathe, but every inhale felt shallow, every exhale shaky. The room spun around me, the edges of my vision blurring, and I knew this moment wasn't just his confession, it was mine too. Somehow, impossibly, our stories weren't separate. They were connected. I lifted my eyes to him, my voice breaking as I tried to speak. I know this face," I whispered, my words barely audible. "I shouldn't, but I do." His eyes widened, shock flashing across his features, followed quickly by something more guarded, something protective. He leaned forward, his expression sharp with disbelief. "What are you saying?" I shook my head, my thoughts a tangled mess. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know how, but I swear, this boy, he looks like someone I once knew, someone who was supposed to be gone." The silence that followed was suffocating. He stared at me, his breathing shallow, his jaw tightening as though my words had struck a chord he wasn't ready to acknowledge. The photo trembled between us, fragile and powerful, holding within it a truth neither of us fully understood but both of us felt in our bones. And in that moment, I realized why my heart had raced the moment I saw it. This wasn't just his story anymore. It was mine too. The photo had become a mirror, reflecting back not just his loss, but something buried in my own life, something I had tried for years not to remember. The intensity in the room grew unbearable, the weight of secrets pressing down on us both. He looked at me as though I had just ripped open a wound he had spent his life hiding, and I looked at him as though I had just stumbled onto a piece of myself I never knew was missing. Neither of us spoke, but the silence screamed louder than any words could. My chest heaved with every breath. His hands clenched tightly in his lap, the photo balanced precariously between us, like a fragile bridge we both feared to cross. And then, as my eyes lingered on the boy's face one more time, the truth struck me with such force that I nearly dropped the photo. Because in that photo, I saw someone I knew. When two broken lives cross paths, the truth cannot stay buried. The photo shook in my hand as though the paper itself carried a pulse. My eyes kept returning to the boy's face, to the curve of his smile, to the scar above his eyebrow. I knew him. I didn't know how. I didn't know why. But something inside me screamed with certainty that this child wasn't a stranger. He was woven into my life in ways I had tried to forget, ways I thought had been buried with time. "I've seen this face before," I whispered, my voice unsteady. My eyes flicked up to the CEO's, searching for answers, but what I found instead was disbelief hardening into suspicion. His gaze sharpened, his body leaning forward, his voice low but edged like a blade. "What do you mean? You've seen him before? How could you possibly know who this is?" I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my thoughts scrambling. Every instinct told me to back away, to protect myself, to deny what my heart already knew. But I couldn't. Not when the truth was staring at me from this fragile piece of paper. "My mother used to tell me stories," I said slowly, my words trembling as I forced them out. "Stories about a boy who was part of our family once. A boy who was close to us, who disappeared when I was too young to understand why." She never gave details, just whispers, fragments, a name she refused to say out loud. But I remember his face. And now I realize it's the same face staring back at me from this photo. His eyes widened, the disbelief flickering into anger. He snatched the photograph from my hand, clutching it to his chest as though I had no right to touch it. "You're lying," he snapped, his voice breaking under the weight of emotions he couldn't hide. "You don't know him. You couldn't." The room felt smaller, with his fury pressing down on me, but I didn't retreat. My hands shook, but my voice, though fragile, didn't falter. "I'm not lying. I wouldn't lie about this. I don't know the whole story, but I know this face belongs to my past as much as it belongs to yours." He rose abruptly from his chair, his tall frame casting a shadow across the office, his fists trembling at his sides. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" His voice thundered, but beneath the rage I heard something else: fear. The kind of fear that comes when the world you've built around your pain begins to crack. I met his eyes, steady despite the storm brewing in his. "I know enough to understand this isn't just your pain anymore. It's mine too." He shook his head violently, pacing across the room, his movements restless, unmoored. "No, this can't be happening. You don't belong in this story. You can't. I buried this part of my life years ago. I buried it because it nearly destroyed me. And now you—" He stopped suddenly, his voice breaking, his shoulders heaving as though the weight of memory had collapsed on him all at once. I stayed silent, my chest heavy, my thoughts racing. His reaction told me everything my words hadn't been able to prove. This boy wasn't just someone from his past. He was someone he had lost, someone whose absence had left scars deeper than betrayal, deeper than success could ever fill. Finally, he turned back to me, his face pale, his eyes searching mine with desperate intensity. "Tell me everything," he demanded, his voice trembling. "What did she say? What do you know about him?" The urgency in his tone left me breathless, but I forced myself to remember. She said he was family once, I began quietly. Not by blood, but by bond. She said he was someone who used to come to our house often, someone who laughed with us, someone we loved like our own. And then, one day, he was gone. She never explained why. She only said it was too painful to talk about, that some losses are better left in silence. But she kept his memory alive in fragments, in the way her voice broke when she spoke of him, in the way she looked at old photographs she thought I didn't notice. And now, looking at this picture, I know she was talking about him. He sank back into his chair as though the weight of my words had crushed him. His hand clutched the photograph tightly, his knuckles white, his eyes shimmering with tears he couldn't hold back. "It can't be," he whispered, shaking his head. "After all these years, after everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. His anger had burned out, leaving behind only raw shock and grief. He looked at me not as a stranger, not as a janitor, but as someone holding a piece of his story he thought was lost forever. My chest tightened as I realized what this meant. Our worlds, so distant, so impossibly apart, had collided in a way neither of us had expected. His grief was no longer his alone. My past had been tangled with his long before this night, and the photograph was the proof neither of us could deny. "I don't know what it means," I admitted, my voice trembling. "I don't know why our lives crossed like this. But I know one thing. This isn't just your secret anymore. It belongs to both of us." His head dropped into his hands, his body shaking with uneven breaths, and for the first time, I saw him as a man not just broken by betrayal, but haunted by ghosts he had spent years trying to bury. His walls had crumbled, and in their ruins, our truths lay exposed, intertwined. I sat there, stunned, my own thoughts spiraling. All my life, I had believed my past was nothing more than shadows and silence, that the missing pieces of my family's story would never be found. And yet here I was, in the office of a man who had always seemed untouchable, holding the very piece that made sense of it all. The clock ticked on, the city lights outside flickering like distant stars, and I knew in that moment that nothing would ever be the same. This wasn't just his confession anymore, it was mine too. The photo had tied us together in a way that neither wealth nor power could undo, and as I sat there, staring at the man who had once been a stranger, now bound to me by a shared past, I realized with a chill running through me that the trajectory of my life had just shifted forever. And in that moment, I knew my life would never be the same again. Respect is born when pain recognizes itself in another. The silence between us was not the silence of strangers anymore, it was the silence of two men who had just uncovered a truth they could not put back into the shadows. The photo still rested on the desk between us, its edges curling under the weight of years, but its presence felt larger than either of us could contain. It wasn't just a picture now. It was a bridge, a fragile, undeniable connection that tied his grief to mine and mine to his. For a long time, neither of us spoke. He sat with his head in his hands, his powerful frame trembling in a way I had never thought possible, while I stared at the city lights beyond the glass walls, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. Yet even without words, something had shifted. He was no longer the untouchable CEO, and I was no longer the invisible janitor. We were just two men, bound by losses too heavy for one heart to carry alone. Eventually, his voice broke the silence. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't commanding, it was tired. "Do you know what it's like to live with ghosts?" he asked, his words quiet, as though he wasn't really speaking to me but to himself. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Yes," I admitted, surprising myself with the certainty in my tone. "Every day." His eyes lifted slowly, meeting mine, and for the first time there was no power in them, no weight of authority. Just recognition, pain recognizing pain, and in that look, something fragile yet undeniable began to form between us. Respect not the kind born of titles or money, but the kind born when two souls see themselves reflected in each other's wounds. From that night on, something changed. I didn't avoid the office when I heard footsteps anymore. I didn't lower my eyes when our paths crossed in the empty halls, and he didn't keep his silence when he saw me. Instead, we spoke not in grand conversations, not in polished exchanges, but in the raw, late-night fragments that only come when two broken men realize they no longer have to suffer alone. He began to talk more openly, sometimes in words that cracked under the weight of emotion, sometimes in quiet whispers as though afraid the walls might betray him. He told me about the nights he lay awake in bed despite his empire, about the loneliness that lingered no matter how many people bowed to him in the daylight. He spoke of his brother's betrayal, of the lover who had abandoned him, of the endless battle of pretending strength when inside he felt hollow. And in return, I offered him what little I had, the truths of my own life. I told him of my childhood, of a home where survival was a daily fight, of a family that had fallen apart under the weight of debts and illnesses. I spoke of the jobs I had taken, one after another, each one chipping away at my pride until I became nothing more than a man who cleaned up after others. I confessed to the nights I had cried quietly in broom closets, praying no one would hear, to the mornings when I had forced myself to smile for the world when inside I felt like I was breaking apart. It wasn't advice I gave him, it was honesty. Honesty stripped of pretense, stripped of hierarchy, stripped of the masks we both wore. And strangely, he listened. For the first time in my life, I saw someone like him. The man whose name carried the weight of entire cities, leaning forward to hear the thoughts of someone like me. Sometimes, our conversations stretched long into the night, the building empty around us, the world asleep while we spoke as though time had bent in our favor. Sometimes, we sat in silence, our words replaced by the shared understanding that silence itself could be a form of healing. And with each passing night, the bond between us deepened, a strange companionship born not of equality in wealth or power, but equality in pain. He once told me, his voice rough with sincerity, "You remind me that I'm human. Everyone else only sees the empire. You see the man." I didn't know how to respond, so I simply nodded, because the truth was, he had reminded me of something too. He reminded me that even the invisible can be seen, that even the forgotten can hold a place in someone else's story. But as our bond grew, so did my fear. It felt too fragile, too dangerous, like glass held between shaking hands. I feared that the world outside these late-night conversations would never understand. I feared that his walls, though broken for now, might be rebuilt stronger than ever. And most of all, I feared what it meant for me to carry a piece of his truth when I could barely carry my own. One night, as we sat in the dim glow of his office lamp, he leaned back in his chair, exhaustion etched deep into his milment face. "You know," he said softly, "for the first time in years, I don't feel completely alone." The word struck me harder than I expected. I wanted to tell him I felt the same, that his presence had become a strange kind of anchor in my drifting life. But I couldn't bring myself to say it aloud. Maybe because saying it would make it too real. Maybe because a part of me feared that if I admitted it, I would lose it. I looked at him then, this man who had everything, yet nothing, and realized we had both been carrying our burdens in silence for far too long. And now, in this fragile bond, we had found a kind of salvation neither of us had expected. For a brief moment, I let myself believe this bond could last. That perhaps, against all odds, two men from opposite worlds could lean on each other long enough to survive their scars. That maybe, just maybe, this connection could save us both. But fate has a cruel way of reminding you that peace never lingers where pain has lived for too long. And just as I began to let my guard down, just as I began to believe in the fragile thread tying us together, something happened that shattered it all. But just when I thought this bond might save us both, everything fell apart again. In powerful worlds, even whispers can kill. For a brief moment, I had begun to believe that the bond we were building might last, that perhaps, against all reason, two broken men from opposite ends of the world could lean on one another long enough to heal. But peace is fragile, and in places where power rules, Peace is often the first thing to be destroyed. It began quietly, as most poisons do. A glance here, a lingering stare there, subtle enough that I almost didn't notice. The building staff, who had always passed me with indifference, now looked at me with something else, curiosity laced with malice. At first, I told myself it was my imagination, that I was being paranoid after everything that had happened. But then the broth whispers started. Soft at first, like rustling leaves in the dark, but quickly growing louder, sharper, impossible to ignore. I would enter a room, and conversations would halt mid-sentence. Heads would tilt toward each other, lips curling with half-hidden smirks. Their voices, lowered but not enough to escape my ears, carried the venom of envy and suspicion. He's getting too close. Have you noticed? He spends too much time up there. Don't you think it's strange? A janitor and the CEO? What's he after? The words stung, but I tried to shrug them off. Let them talk, I told myself. They didn't know the truth of what had happened between us, the late-night confessions, the shared scars. They couldn't possibly understand the bond born not of ambition, but of pain. But gossip, once planted, doesn't stay quiet. It grows, twisting itself into darker shapes, feeding on envy until it becomes something far more dangerous. Soon, the whispers evolved into accusations. I overheard one man telling another that I must be manipulating him, that no janitor could earn a place by the CEO's side without some hidden agenda. Another swore that I was digging for secrets, hoping to blackmail my way out of poverty. Some even suggested betrayal, that I was reporting everything I learned in those late-night conversations to people who wanted to see him fall. Each word was a knife, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. Because while I knew the truth, I also knew how fragile trust could be. And if those words reached him, if the poison of suspicion seeped into his mind, it could undo everything. I noticed the shift in him before he said a word. At first, it was small. He grew quieter when I entered the room, his words more measured, his eyes studying me with a weight that hadn't been there before. He no longer leaned forward during our conversations. Instead, he leaned back, as though creating a distance neither of us acknowledged. He asked fewer questions, and when he did, they carried a sharpness, a hidden edge, as though he was searching for cracks in my answers. One night, when I brought him his usual late coffee, he didn't thank me. Instead, he let the silence stretch until I felt like an intruder in a space that had once felt almost safe. His gaze lingered on me too long, unreadable, like a man torn between belief and doubt. I told myself it was my imagination again, that the long hours and heavy confessions had finally taken their toll. But deep inside, I knew better. The whispers had reached him, and now they lived between us, poisoning every moment of silence, every glance, every word left unsaid. The distance grew heavier with each passing day. I felt it in the way he hesitated before speaking, in the way he studied me as though I were both ally and stranger. The bond we had built in nights of shared pain now trembled on the edge of collapse, weakened not by betrayal but by the suggestion of it. And that is the cruelest thing about rumors: they don't need to be true to destroy you. They only need to be believed long enough to plant a seed of doubt. I fought against it in small ways. I stayed consistent, steady, careful never to cross lines I shouldn't. I worked harder than ever, cleaning floors until my hands ached, scrubbing glass until it gleamed, as if to prove through sweat what words could not. But still, I felt the doubt growing in him. Still, I saw the way his gaze lingered, heavy with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. And then one night, the unspoken tension finally broke. I had been finishing up my rounds when I heard his voice call my name. It wasn't sharp, but it wasn't soft either. It carried the weight of something final, something unavoidable. I stepped into his office, my chest tight, and found him standing by the window, the city lights spilling across his shoulders like fire. His back was to me, his posture stiff, his hands clasped behind him. For a moment, he didn't turn around. He just stared out at the city below, his silence thick with words unspoken. And then, slowly, he turned to face me, His eyes were different that night. Not the eyes of a man confessing, not the eyes of a man finding companionship in shared grief, but the eyes of a man weighing judgment, cold, searching, filled with the kind of doubt that cut deeper than anger ever could. "Tell me," he said, his voice low, steady, but laced with something sharp enough to slice through me. "Why are you really here?" The question hung in the air like a blade, and in that moment, I felt the fragile bond we had built tremble on the edge of destruction. And then, he confronted me with a look I'll never forget. "Trust is not given, it is tested in fire." His words struck harder than any insult, sharper than any threat. "Why should I trust you?" The question echoed through the office like thunder, rattling every fragile piece of ground I had built beneath my feet. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, staring at the man whose gaze had once held the faintest trace of compassion, but now carried only suspicion. He wasn't asking out of curiosity, he was demanding an answer that would decide my place in his world, perhaps even my life itself. I tried to speak, but my voice faltered, caught between fear and desperation. My hands, rough from years of labor, clenched tightly at my sides, as though holding on to myself was the only thing keeping me from collapsing. The silence stretched unbearably long, each second a weight pressing harder against my chest. At last, I forced the words out, though they trembled as they left me. "Because I have nothing to gain by lying to you. Nothing. You may think I'm here for some hidden reason, that I want something from you, but the truth is, all I've ever wanted is to survive. That's it. Survival. A roof, food, enough to keep my family from drowning in debts we didn't choose." His eyes narrowed, studying me like a man trying to read every line of a confession for a hidden flaw. I could feel the heat of his doubt pressing against my skin, but I couldn't stop. If I did, the poison of rumors would finish what they had started. "I never came here to manipulate you," I continued, my voice stronger now, though thick with emotion. "I came here because this was the job I could get. A janitor. That's who I am. That's who I've been for years. And yes, maybe it doesn't make sense to others why a man like you would talk to someone like me. Maybe it looks strange. But do you know what I saw in you that night when I found you crying?" I paused, my throat tightening, my chest heaving with every shallow breath. He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't offer even a flicker of reassurance. Still, I pressed on. I saw myself. I saw the loneliness I had carried for years reflected in your eyes. I saw a man who had everything the world could offer but still bore the same kind of pain I thought belonged only to people like me. And when you spoke, when you shared your truth, I didn't see a CEO anymore. I saw a man, broken, human, just like me. The words poured out of me faster now, like a dam breaking. I no longer cared if my voice cracked, if my eyes burned with tears I couldn't hold back. This was my truth, and if he didn't believe it, then at least I would fall with honesty in my hands. I didn't ask for your secrets. I didn't beg for your trust. You chose to give me a piece of yourself, and I listened because I knew what it meant to carry that kind of weight. Do you think I'd throw that away for money? For power? For some pathetic rumor? No, I wouldn't, because I know what it's like to be invisible. I know what it's like to cry when no one is supposed to hear. And for once in my life, I wasn't invisible to you. For once, someone saw me. That's why I stayed. That's why I listened. Not because I wanted something, but because, finally, it felt like I mattered. My voice cracked on the last word, but I didn't care. My chest ached with the rawness of what I had just confessed, my knees weak, my hands trembling so violently I had to steady myself against the back of a chair. He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his eyes locked onto mine, his silence heavy and suffocating. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, each second pounding in my ears like a drum of judgment. The air between us was thick, charged, as though the entire world was holding its breath, waiting for him to decide if I was worth believing. Doubt clawed at me as I waited. What if this was the end? What if my words meant nothing against the venom of whispers? What if he saw me not as a man, but as exactly what they said I was: a leech, a manipulator, a fraud? The thought twisted in my gut, making me sick, but I forced myself to keep my head high, to meet his gaze without flinching. If I was going to be cast aside, I would not go as a coward. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped closer, his expression still unreadable, his silence heavier than any scream. His eyes never wavered, never softened, never revealed the decision forming behind them. I braced myself for whatever would come: anger, dismissal, rejection, anything. But instead, he stopped just a few feet away, his eyes burning into mine, his face carved in stone. His silence stretched so long it felt like it would crush me, like it would strip the very skin from my bones. And then, just as my chest threatened to give out under the pressure, just as my own faith began to falter, he opened his mouth. His silence felt like a knife, until finally, he spoke. One decision can destroy a life or rebuild it. The silence after my confession felt endless. It pressed into my chest, into my lungs, into the very marrow of my bones. I had given him everything: my truth, my pain, my desperate honesty, and now I stood exposed, trembling, waiting for the verdict of a man who could end everything with a single word. He didn't move at first. His eyes locked onto mine, sharp and unreadable, his face as unmoving as stone. For a moment, I thought I had lost him forever, that the whispers had carved too deep, that my truth wasn't enough to silence the venom of envy. My throat tightened, my body rigid, as I prepared myself for dismissal, for rejection, for the kind of finality that would break me beyond repair. Then he exhaled, slow, heavy, almost like a man releasing a weight he had carried too long. He stepped closer, and though his expression didn't soften, his eyes did, just slightly. Enough for me to notice, enough to make my heart stumble inside my chest. "I should dismiss you," he said at last, his voice low, steady, but layered with something unspoken. "That's what everyone expects. That's what the rumors demand. To end this before it poisons me further, before it destroys what I've built." He paused, his words hanging between us like smoke. "But I won't. Because when I look at you, I don't see a liar. I don't see a manipulator. I see a man who carries the same scars I do. And that, I can't ignore." The air left my lungs in a rush I hadn't realized I was holding. Relief and disbelief crashed into me all at once, leaving me trembling on unsteady legs. My eyes burned, my chest aching with the rawness of his words. He trusted me. Against the poison, against the whispers, against the weight of a world that told him to sever ties with me, he chose to believe. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. My gratitude, my relief, my trembling sense of hope, they all tangled in my throat, until all I could do was bow my head, fighting back the flood of tears that threatened to spill. "You may not see it now," he continued, his voice quieter, almost thoughtful. "But you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Not loyalty, not obedience, something else." His eyes searched mine with intensity I could barely hold. "You've reminded me that even at the top, I am still human. And perhaps that is worth more than all the empire I've built." The words shook me more than I could admit. For so long, I had believed myself invisible, a shadow moving silently through hallways, a man reduced to his uniform and broom. And yet here I stood, being told by the man who owned towers of glass and steel that I had given him something he couldn't buy, couldn't build, couldn't command. "Humanity," I whispered hoarsely. "I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," he replied firmly, but not unkindly. "Words are cheap. You've already proven yourself in ways they never will." For the first time since this fragile connection began, I felt something I had never expected to feel in his presence. Safety. Not safety in the sense of comfort or ease, but safety in the knowledge that I had been seen and not cast aside, that my truth had been heard and chosen over lies. That night changed everything. The days that followed were different. The poisonous stares from staff didn't vanish, and the whispers didn't die overnight. But they lost their power, because now, whenever I passed through the halls, I no longer felt the weight of suspicion pressing against me. I felt his decision, his silent shield. His choice had spoken louder than any defense I could have given. He trusted me, and with that trust came a strength I hadn't known I possessed. He treated me differently too, not in grand gestures, not in ways that would draw attention, but in subtle, undeniable shifts. He asked for my thoughts on things he never would have before, small details that most would dismiss as beneath him. He lingered longer in conversations, listening more than speaking. His walls lowered just enough for me to glimpse the man beneath the title. And in turn, I carried in myself differently. No longer a ghost, no longer an invisible shadow, but a man who had been acknowledged, believed, chosen. The broom in my hand still swept the same floors. The rag still polished the same glass, but my reflection in those surfaces no longer felt like a stranger. It felt like me, seen, real, unbroken. There were nights when he and I would once again find ourselves in the quiet of his office, the city lights painting the walls in fractured patterns. We didn't always speak. Sometimes we simply sat, the silence between us no longer suffocating but grounding, a reminder that trust didn't always need words. Other nights, he told me more of his past, the betrayals, the loneliness, the ghosts that haunted him still. And when he did, I listened. Not as a janitor, not as a subordinate, but as a man who understood. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't brotherhood. It was something else, something fragile, forged not by choice, but by the strange collision of pain and truth. A bond built in fire, tempered by doubt, and now strengthened by trust. And yet, beneath it all, I knew this was not the end. Because trust, once tested, is never the same again. It doesn't disappear, but it doesn't return untouched either. It lingers with scars, with reminders of how close it came to breaking. And though he had chosen to believe me, though he had pulled me from the edge of despair with that decision, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fire we had survived together was only a glimpse of the storms yet to come. I should have been content. I should have been grateful that the poison had not destroyed us, that the rumors had failed to tear apart what we had built. But as I looked into his eyes that night, when the office lights dimmed and the city outside burned with restless life, I felt a chill creep into my bones. Because I knew, somehow, instinctively, that the story we had stumbled into was not finished. His decision had saved me. Yes, it had saved us. Both. But decisions, like scars, carry consequences. And neither of us could yet see the shadows gathering beyond the fragile light of trust we had found. But none of us knew. That night was only the beginning. Sometimes the ones who save us wear the simplest uniforms. The days after his decision felt like stepping into a world I had never known. For years, I had carried myself like a shadow, silent, invisible, slipping through corridors without leaving a trace. I had accepted invisibility as my fate, as though the uniform I wore was a disguise that erased the man beneath it. But now, something had shifted, and it wasn't only in me, it was in the way he looked at me, in the way others looked at me, in the way the very air in those halls seemed to change. It happened quietly at first, a glance from him when staff whispered nearby, his eyes sharp enough to silence their venom without a single word, a nod of acknowledgement in the morning, small but deliberate, as though he was reminding the world that I existed. And then, one day, it happened openly, so openly, that no rumor could ever stand against it again. We were in the main hall of the building, a space that always echoed with power and formality. Staff lined the walls as executives filed past, their clipped conversations weaving into a symphony of self-importance. I was there too, broom in hand, ready to pass unnoticed as always. But then he stopped. The CEO, the man whose footsteps silenced entire boardrooms, whose presence demanded attention like thunder, paused in the middle of that hall. His gaze swept briefly across the gathered staff before settling on me. For a moment, I froze, broom still poised in my hand, certain that I had done something wrong. The hall grew quieter, expectant, and then, in a voice steady enough to reach every corner of that cavernous room, he said, "This man matters here." The words were simple, just 4 syllables, but they were heavier than gold. heavier than the rumors, heavier than the years of invisibility that had weighed me down. Gasps rippled through the hall, whispers stilled. Eyes turned to me, not with mockery this time, not with suspicion, but with shock, because in a single moment he had done something no amount of gossip could undo. He had made me visible. I felt my chest tighten, my throat burning with emotions I couldn't name. My hands shook around the broom, and for the first time, I didn't want to hide them. He had not said it as a favor. He had not said it to embarrass me. He had said it as truth. And truth, spoken by a man like him, was impossible to deny. From that day forward, the air changed. The whispers stopped, not because envy had disappeared, but because his word had drowned them out. The smirks turned to silence, the glances to reluctant acknowledgement. No one dared call me invisible anymore, not when the man they feared most had named me as someone who mattered. But the greatest change was not in them. It was in me. For the first time, I carried myself with dignity that wasn't borrowed, that wasn't imagined. It lived in my chest, steady as my own heartbeat. I wasn't just a janitor anymore. I was a man who had been trusted, seen, acknowledged. And that acknowledgement gave me something wealth never could: worth. At night, when the building was quiet again, he and I still found ourselves in the solitude of his office. But those conversations no longer carried the same desperation as before. There was still pain, still ghosts, still memories that haunted us both, but there was also something new. Hope, a fragile, trembling hope that maybe, just maybe, we had both been given something we didn't know how to name. He once said to me, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "You remind me that strength isn't about empires or power. It's about surviving when the world tries to erase you, and you've survived." The words stayed with me, carved themselves into me, not because they came from him, but because they rang true. I had survived. Not just the labor, not just the invisibility, not just the hunger for dignity, but myself. I had survived the voice inside me that told me I was nothing. And for once, I no longer believed that voice. As for him, I watched the change too. He stood taller, yes, but differently, not the stiff, defensive posture of a man protecting an empire, but the steadier stance of someone who no longer carried his ghosts alone. The haunted look in his eyes softened, not vanishing but no longer consuming him. He had found, in me of all people, something he didn't know he needed, someone who saw him, not his empire. And so, two lives that had been broken in silence began to stitch themselves back together in the unlikeliest of ways, not through wealth, not through power, not through promises, but through the fragile, undeniable truth of being seen. I often thought back to that night when it all began, the faint sound of muffled sobs in an empty office, the shock of realizing they belonged to him, the impossible choice I made to step closer instead of walking away. That single choice had rewritten both our lives. I had thought, then, that it might destroy me. Instead, it gave me something far greater than I could have imagined. Now, when I walked through the halls with my broom, I no longer felt like a shadow. I no longer told myself that invisibility was my fate, because I knew, deep inside, that my worth wasn't measured by my uniform, nor by the whispers of those who tried to erase me. My worth lived in the simple, undeniable truth that I had been seen, and that I had seen him too. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about titles. It was about two men who, in different uniforms, carried the same scars. Two men who found in each other a reminder that pain doesn't have to be silent, that survival doesn't have to be lonely, that broken lives can still bend toward something whole. And that was worth more than anything else. That night, as I finished my shift and the building grew silent around me, I paused in the empty hall, the same hall where he had spoken those words. "This man matters here." The lights reflected off the polished floor, and for the first time, I saw my own reflection, looking back not as a ghost, not as an invisible servant, but as a man who had endured, a man who had survived, a man who had been given a second chance. I leaned on my broom, breathing in the silence, and let the truth wash over me. This wasn't the end of my story, nor his. It was something else, something new. And that night, in the silence of the office halls, I realized we had both been given a second chance. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if you were in the janitor's place? Hit the like button if this story moved you, and subscribe for more powerful stories that reveal the hidden battles people carry. Your support is what keeps these stories alive.